Thank you, Mrs. Kelegama, Dushni, distinguished guests, friends, and colleagues. Let me first say that this is an enormous privilege and an honor to be given the opportunity to deliver the inaugural Saman Kelegama Memorial Lecture. As everybody in this room knows, Saman was the embodiment of many outstanding qualities, both professional and human. Saman, the professional, started as a trade economist, as we heard, but subsequently acquired in-depth expertise in many branches of economics. He excelled both as an academic as well as a key player in influencing and formulating public policy. As an academic, he had a string of publications and was a much sought-after speaker at various local, regional, and international fora. In the public policy sphere, he served on countless high-level commissions and committees, boards, as well as advisory bodies. He also became a major private sector personality through, inter alia, his leadership of Singer. At the time of his shocking and untimely demise, he was putting his heart and soul into his role as the chief negotiator, the lead negotiator in the economic partnership agreements with China, India, and Singapore. He also made a significant contribution to the work that was done to regain GSP+. To speak only of Saman's very considerable professional excellence would do him a grave injustice. He was an institution builder and an outstanding human being. He was very much at the center of IPS's growth from its early days. He gave leadership to a dedicated group of researchers who have built IPS into, very plausibly, the leading socio-economic think tank in the country. The endowment fund and the building where this event is taking place are also testimony to his success as an institution builder. It is very appropriate that this auditorium is named after him. Those of us who had the great privilege of knowing Saman also have a keen awareness of his human qualities. He was always unfailingly kind and courteous. Despite his many accomplishments and accolades, Saman was an extremely modest and unassuming man, who was sympathetic and humane in all his dealings with contemporaries as well as junior colleagues whom he inspired. His untimely departure is an immeasurable loss to the country and everything else that was touched by his life, but most of all, of course, to his close family. What I propose to do in terms of addressing the topic at hand, if I may kind of broadly outline the structure of my remarks, I'm going to start with setting out the opportunities, trying to make the case that this is all arguably the best set of circumstances Sri Lanka has faced for 4 or 5 decades. And then turn to some of the challenges, 2 paradigm shifts which we need to respond to. One is the graduation that we have made to low middle income country status, and secondly, the aging that is now coming upon us, aging of the population. And some of the other challenges which I'd like to touch upon and maybe draw some lessons is the need to avoid repeating cycles of stop-go policies as a result of boosting growth through unsustainable macroeconomic policies. Secondly, another challenge is the need to synchronize stabilization and structural reforms. Doing one without the other leads to the growth deficit that Tushni has been speaking about. Yet another challenge is to continue what is being done to put in place robust, clear frameworks for macroeconomic policy making and their institutionalization. It's important to institutionalize these frameworks so that their resilience and they last beyond the IMF program and on into the future. Then I'd like to turn to the growth agenda and talk a little bit about the growth model that is being put in place and how one can strengthen the growth framework. And finally, just give a little thumbnail sketch of some of the major development projects that have been put in place, and to wind up with some observations on the international dimension. So if I may start with opportunities, why do I say this is the best shot Sri Lanka has had for 4 or 5 decades? The first point to make is that there are no major economic drags on the economic prospects of the country. If you look back as far as the late 1950s, for about 25-30 years, there was a dramatic and secular decline in Sri Lanka's terms of trade. In fact, if you look at the World Development Report of 1952, there's a box citing Sri Lanka as a classical example of a country that has been buffeted by extreme terms of trade decline. Now, at a time when the surpluses in the economy were declining, we had a demographic surge in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. The population increased initially in the 15 with the control of malaria, and then in subsequent years we saw this demographic increase. So you had surpluses coming down, population going up. And as a response to this kind of squeeze that the economy experienced, the governments of that time put in place inward-looking statist policies. In the 60s and 70s, there was a strong intellectual wave which advocated inward-looking policies to protect the domestic economy from the vagaries of a global economy, which was characterized by structures and rules forged during the colonial era. And you had really the pioneering work was probably done in Latin America with people like Prebish, Singer, and the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, which came up with the import substitution strategies. And of course, closer to home, Professor Mahalanobis and his approach to the development model for India was again based on autarkic and inward-looking strategies. So that was, in many quarters in the developing world, the consensus in terms of how one should structure one's economic policies. However, as we are now able to conclude with the benefit of hindsight, that was clearly not the appropriate set of policies. I should have also said that from a political economy point of view, the case was made that there should be a strong role for the state at that time in those days, simply because the domestic capitalist class and domestic private sector was not strong enough to shift towards greater economic sovereignty to go in parallel with the political independence that had been secured. Despite all these fairly substantive arguments in favor of inward-looking policies, if one looked at the outcomes, clearly they were unsatisfactory, because the upshot was that economic stagnation was what we saw, and the economy became trapped in low investment, low growth, high unemployment syndrome. So three big drags so far: terms of trade decline, demographic surge, inappropriate inward-looking strategies. Then the economy was liberalized in 1977, and of course, shortly after that, we had the onset of the conflict, which lasted for almost 3 decades. And so the payoff in terms of the liberalization of the economy was not secured. Now, if one looks around, there are no such major drags on the economic prospects of the country today. On top of that, we have the advantage of geographical location. As we all know, Sri Lanka is located in Asia, which is the fastest growing continent, and South Asia is the fastest growing sub-region in the world. And interestingly, investors in some of the aging countries of East and Southeast Asia are increasingly recognizing the opportunities that exist for them through leveraging the demographic dividend in South Asia. Though Sri Lanka is now on the cusp of aging, it is well located and enjoys the livability advantage to act as a hub for businesses from Asia and elsewhere seeking to participate in the South Asian growth narrative. Even more importantly, the opportunity now exists for Sri Lanka to rediscover its roots, where for millennia it was an economic hub in the middle of the Indian Ocean. The evolving geopolitical dynamics of the Indian Ocean region greatly enhance Sri Lanka's locational advantage. So this is another reason why location has become even more advantageous for the country. And of course, it is located 20 miles from the fastest growing large economy in the world. And within India, you have the 5 southern states, which have enjoyed close to double-digit growth now for a number of years. And of course, Sri Lanka is slap bang in the middle of the maritime Silk Route, China's maritime Silk Route. And the other advantages in terms of access to the Middle East, to East Africa, being equidistant between the Far East and Europe, all those advantages still persist. So what are some of the lessons we can draw from this? And a key lesson to be learned is that locational advantages mean there is a very high premium now attached to developing Sri Lanka as a top 30 ease of doing business country, to enable it to become the hub in the middle of the Indian Ocean. And if the Kra Canal is completed, these advantages will be amplified. It is also important that Sri Lanka maintains, and it's another lesson that we need to absorb, it is also important that Sri Lanka maintains an on-aligned neutral stance which enables it to leverage the enhanced interests being shown by several major powers from both the East and West. And in order to do so, there must be clarity regarding our national strategic interests and economic priorities so that Sri Lanka can engage with the external world in a manner that is beneficial to the country. So those are some of the opportunities. As I said, no major drags like the previous 4 or 5 decades, and we have locational advantages. We have the geopolitics as they are evolving in the Indian Ocean also playing to our advantage. So what are some of the challenges? A couple of paradigm shifts, as I mentioned. One is this graduation that we have made from low income to low middle income country status. Sri Lanka, as the second country after Chile to liberalize its economy after pursuing autarkic policies, received very generous amounts of foreign aid. This foreign aid, in a way, spoilt us because we were able to live beyond our means and not effect some of the discipline and the structural reforms that were necessary to transform the economy. Now we have graduated to low middle income country status and have to deal with the challenges of being exposed to rating agencies and being dependent on international capital markets to raise the external financing that we need. In the past, we got foreign aid. 60% of it came from IDA and from the Asian Development Fund on extremely concessional terms. We're talking about 10-year grace periods, 30, 40-year maturity, and less than 1% administration charge. Now when we go to the market, we're borrowing at 6% or more. So this is a totally different paradigm. And it's extremely important that we internalize the change in circumstances that the country is confronted with. And if already, I think, because we have not perhaps taken this paradigm shift on board sufficiently, it can be argued that we have given away a fair chunk of our national economic sovereignty. In Asia, Sri Lanka and Mongolia are the only two countries to have an IMF program. To have an IMF program in Asia at this time actually takes some doing. It demonstrates the extent of our mismanagement. The IMF doesn't come and impose its programs on us. They don't come and take away national economic sovereignty. We go to the IMF when we mess things up. So this is something that we need to be very clear about. And if we don't have an IMF program, it will be very difficult for us to access the external financing that we need. And if we are not able to do that, we would have to have import compression, which would be extremely painful for the population of the country. And really, once you get into this paradigm, you need to get away from what may be characterized as the toxic combination of populist politics and a deeply entrenched entitlement culture among the people that has characterized our post-independence period. It has contributed to us regressing from being second to Japan on almost all indicators at the time of independence, now to a situation where a number of Asian countries have left us behind. So that's one paradigm shift. The other paradigm shift that we need to take on board relates to our unique experience in the demographic transition that we are experiencing before a major economic transformation. We are on the cusp of aging at a much earlier stage of our development process. So what are the implications of that? It means that you can no longer drive growth simply through labor augmentation. It means that we are having to work much harder in terms of driving productivity, in terms of increasing total factor productivity at a much earlier stage of our development trajectory. So innovation, R&D, all of that is becoming much more important because we are facing a much tougher challenge in terms of driving growth through productivity increases at an earlier stage of our development process. We simply can't add to growth by adding to the labor force anymore. And really, so the demographic dividend, we've already enjoyed our demographic dividend. And that probably, or may well be, one of the reasons why the economy was, in my view, extraordinarily resilient during the conflict years. Because that's when we enjoyed our demographic dividend. And to average 4% growth, as we did during the conflict period, and clearly it was impressive. And one of the reasons we were able to do that, I believe, is that we were enjoying our demographic dividend during that period. But now the downside is, we're having to work much harder to drive growth. And in a way, this challenge is a result of our success in educating the girl child, in the sense that through an entirely voluntary population policy, we have reached a point where our population is aging much earlier than one would normally expect in a country's development process. If I can turn to some of the other challenges, the need to break this repeating cycles of stop-go policies. Right? If you look at the post-independence era, we've had these repeating cycles right the way through. we've had 15 IMF programs, I think. I don't know how many of them are after 1977, but I think the vast majority of them. And so it means that we probably have had about 15 of these cycles. Because each time we have the boom and bust, when the bust comes, we go to the IMF. I don't know whether any other country has had 15 IMF programs. Of course, we've only completed 2. But we've had to go to the IMF probably more than anybody else. I don't know for a fact that it's more, but certainly 15 is very many. And if you look at the post-conflict period also, the last 9-10 years, we've had again 2 boom and bust cycles. In the immediate aftermath of the end of the conflict, the government of the day was very keen to deliver a peace dividend, and it stimulated an unsustainable boom through inappropriate macroeconomic policies. So we had the fiscal deficit increase, we had there was fiscal forbearance with monetary policy monetizing some of the fiscal deficit, and the exchange rate for periods was overvalued, and reserves were used to defend it. But of course, that's not sustainable. You can create these sugar highs in terms of growth through inappropriate macroeconomic policy, but you can't sustain it. So by February 2012, the government had to introduce a very tough stabilization package. If you recall, there was actually a credit course, there was a credit ceiling, not just an increase in interest rate, but a credit ceiling. The exchange rate was depreciated by 15%. So you had this, the brakes were put on once the boom became unsustainable. And of course the same thing happened again. In 2015, you had the expansionary effects of the November 2014 budget, which was then significantly augmented by the populist measures of the interim budget at the beginning of 2015. And of course, the inevitable outcome was again another boom and bust. And by, I think it was about March, April of 2016, the fund had to go to the IMF. The previous government actually, in 2012, it was in the middle of an IMF program, but if I remember correctly, that IMF program was in abeyance, wasn't formally suspended, but was in abeyance, but they had to resuscitate the IMF program in February 2012. So these kind of repeating cycles of inappropriate policies have been the kind of bane of our macroeconomic management, and of course they feed through into the real economy as well. Another point that needs to be internalized very carefully is the fact that now that we are a low middle income country with exposure to rating agencies and the international capital markets, is that the way crises play themselves out is what will be qualitatively different. In the past, when we had a balance of payments crisis, we then had a mix of concessional money from the IMF and from other donors and adjustment to stabilize the economy. Now we have very limited access to concessional money, so the financing has to come from international capital markets and adjustment, a mix of capital markets, international money raised in capital markets and adjustment. Now the thing about being a low-income country, the IMF may negotiate a fairly tough program, but they don't cut you loose. So you will get a program of sorts, and that program will then catalyze some money. And you will have to do some adjustment, but there will be some money as well. But today, the international capital markets are not going to do you any favors. If they think that we are no longer creditworthy because our macroeconomic fundamentals have deteriorated, they will stop lending to us. They either stop. So you have no financing. And the rebalancing of the economy has to be borne entirely by adjustment. And that is these financial crises are far, far, far more painful than the kinds of balance of payments crises we've experienced in the past. If we do have a crisis this time, it will have far more devastating social and political consequences, because the response to it will be very different. Past, concessional money, some adjustment. Now you have a stop and all adjustment. And that can be very, very painful, which is what Greece has had, which is what Thailand, Indonesia had during the Asian crisis, which a number of Latin American countries have had since the 1980s. So financial crises are very different and very, very much more painful. So, what are we doing to address this? And I will come to that later. We're putting in place some frameworks which will hopefully embed sound macroeconomic policy making frameworks. I'll come to that in a little while. But before that, let me talk about another challenge. And that is the need to synchronize stabilization and structural reforms. In many countries, not only developing, also in advanced countries, often when there is excess demand coming through to the system, through the fiscal operations or the monetary operations, and there is a stabilization program that needs to be put in place, the structural reforms that need to go in to strengthen the growth framework tend to get implemented slowly. There is a tendency to kick the can down the road when it comes to structural reforms. And the inevitable outcome is that you get a significant slowdown in growth. Because after all, a stabilization program is intended to compress demand. So you have a depressive effect on growth. Now that has to be offset by aggressive reforms to improve the growth framework of the country. If you don't do that, then you have a big growth deficit. And that is what has happened both in 2012 and to an extent in 2016. The stabilization started, but the pro-growth structural reforms were much slower. And so you have this deficit. Now I tried to make the case that is now being addressed, hopefully more quickly than it has in the recent past. But you have to get these two synchronized, because just putting in place a stabilization without the structural reforms, it means that growth and employment and incomes do suffer. Okay, so let me now turn to these frameworks that we are putting in place to strengthen macroeconomic policy making, and how we're trying to institutionalize this framework. So on fiscal policy side, as you know, the government is in the midst of a revenue enhancement-based fiscal consolidation program. And there have been significant gains. The IRA, the Inland Revenue Act, the VAT reforms, the pricing formula for fuel. All of these are significant and difficult reforms that the government has been able to achieve. And we are beginning to see the results already. For the second time since 1955, there was a primary surplus in the budget last year. And for the first time since 1987, if things stay on track, we will have a surplus in the current account of the budget this year. So some of the structural problems that existed on the fiscal side are beginning to be addressed. And these advances are being institutionalized by the government considering, and it's committed itself as part of the IMF program, to introduce fiscal rules. We have a Fiscal Management Responsibility Act with the targets for the budget deficit and the debt to GDP ratio, but introduced around 2002, I think, but pretty much in every year we've reached those targets. Now the idea is to give teeth to this act by really specifying particular reasons when the target can be breached, i.e. say a natural disaster and there's an enormous relief program that has to be funded, or say there's a massive exogenous shock and there's a depression in the economy and there has to be aggressive counter-cyclical fiscal policy. In those instances, of course, the target can be breached, but even when it is breached, the government would be required to then set in place how it is going to get back on target again. So that is the framework that I hope will be institutionalized by the end of this year or early next year, which will help us to then embed and make the gains in terms of fiscal consolidation more resilient and durable. On the monetary policy side, the central bank is in the process of transitioning to a flexible inflation targeting regime. Now, already we are kind of in the midst of this. The forecasting and modeling capacity of the central bank has been strengthened, and the central bank is working on legal and accountability frameworks, which will give the central bank the independence it requires to run a flexible inflation targeting regime. But of course, in return for greater independence, there would also be greater accountability. So the focus really will be on having a much more forward-looking, data-driven monetary policy, and also focusing on the anchoring of inflation expectations as part of this forward-looking policy. For the exchange rate, the objective is to manage the exchange rate flexibly, because under a flexible inflation targeting regime, you need flexibility in the exchange rate to bring about adjustments in the current account. However, the central bank will not hesitate to intervene to smoothen undue volatility. If there is volatility which is not justified by the underlying fundamentals, clearly then the central bank will try to smoothen the path of the exchange rate. The fourth frame, and also the central bank is working to develop parameters within which the exchange rate will be managed, and once those are worked out, they will be made, there will be more transparent framework within which the exchange rate will be managed. The fourth framework relates to the Active Liability Management Act. What that has done is given much more flexibility and headroom for managing the debt burden of the country. As you know, we have a bunching of external debt from 2019 onwards, and this act gives us flexibility by the fact that in the past, the Appropriation Act limited the borrowing in any given year to the borrowing requirement of the government in that particular year. If the government needed to borrow 10 billion rupees, that's all you could borrow. You couldn't borrow, even if the market conditions were favorable, you couldn't borrow additional money to build up a buffer to manage the debt obligations coming up ahead. But the Active Liability Management Act now gives that flexibility under very tightly circumscribed circumstances. You can't just go off on a borrowing spree. Any borrowing under the Act has to be approved by Cabinet and Parliament. But what it does do is now give this additional flexibility for the central bank to manage the government's debt. And the central bank is in the process of developing a medium-term debt strategy, and within that a liability management strategy, and we're confident that provided the fiscal consolidations stays on track, the government's debt obligations can be managed. And I should say that as far as domestic debt is concerned, the peak was this year in 2018. From now onwards, the domestic debt repayments taper off, which actually will now give us a greater scope to mobilize more money domestically, thereby reducing the pressure to borrow abroad. Let me now say a little bit about the growth model. That's another challenge. In the post-conflict period, in the immediate aftermath of the conflict, as you know, the growth strategy was based on public investment in infrastructure, largely financed by foreign commercial borrowing. Now that model has limited scope, has limited mileage, and that mileage became even more circumscribed because the set of policies that were followed meant that exports as a GDP came down significantly. They were 33% in 2000, came down to 12.4%. And at the same time, you had this build-up in commercial debt. So if you have large-scale commercial borrowing from abroad, at the same time you allow your exports to fall, and you are not overly scrupulous about the rates of return on your projects, clearly you end up with the kind of debt dynamics that confronts the country now. So that is really the problem that we need to address, and we are in the process of addressing. So that's the growth strategy in the immediate years after the war, which is, as I said, ran out of mileage after a while. And so now the growth strategy is a private sector driven strategy with exports and FDI as pillars. I've been a public servant all my life. I don't have any great ideological belief that the private sector is the panacea for all ills, because if you look around the world, there are different mixes of the state and the private sector, all of them giving good outcomes. China has a model, Vietnam has a model, there are more market-oriented models. But for Sri Lanka, given the lack of fiscal space, we have no choice. Our public debt dynamics are such. Our debt to GDP is 77%. And the figure for our comparator countries, the median for our comparator countries is about 55. So we're an outlier when it comes to debt. We don't have the fiscal space to have a status development strategy. We have no choice. It's not an ideological thing. It's just a practical thing. So it's the private sector. Of course, there can be PPPs, but basically one has to create the conditions for private investment, domestic and foreign, to drive the growth process. So why exports and FDI? Exports, clearly, one is, if we want to really get out of the debt situation we're in, we have to increase receipts of foreign exchange. The Liability Management Act gives us various instruments which can smoothen out the maturities. It can reduce rollover risk, but it won't really reduce the stock of debt. For that, we have to earn money to pay it back. And so exports are needed to get out of the kind of debt situation we're in, but above all, it's needed to drive the growth and the employment generation that the economy requires, because in an economy of 20 million people, with per capita income, purchasing power of just over $4,000, you're not going to be able to drive 5, 6, 7% growth for any period of time, depending just on domestic demand. So exports has to be a key part of the growth story. And FDI, why FDI? If you look at the successful countries in Asia, whether they're as big as China or small as Singapore, the export transformation that took them to a higher trajectory of growth and development was supported in a material way by foreign direct investment. It fills the savings investment gap, it gives you markets, Professor Ricardo Hausman was here recently, it gives you know-how, which is crucial. exports and FDI are critical, and they're key pillars of this private sector-driven strategy. And I should mention, I see Indra here in the audience, so I should say that the National Export Strategy has identified 6 focus areas: ICT, ICT BPM, wellness tourism, port building, electrical and electronic components, processed food and beverages, and spices and concentrates. So that is the growth model. What about strengthening the growth framework to make this model work? The Government Vision 2025 document actually sets out the growth framework, how one can strengthen the growth framework. There are measures set out to strengthen the factor markets, land, labor, and capital. Already there is a program underway to improve the investment climate and investment promotion. And here on both those fronts, progress is being made. The investment climate, there were task forces, I think, on 8 of the 10 pillars of the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business Index. Those task forces have come up with their action plan, which are now being implemented, and we're beginning to see results. Last year, it was a record year for FDI. And there was a record year for exports as well. So, of course, one's got to be very cautious in talking about records, because they are records from extremely low bases. Right? So there's nothing to write home about, but still, the direction of travel is positive in the sense that we did have record levels of exports and FDI. So the investment climate is being improved. I can't remember what SWIFT stands for. Ruminda has to help me out. What does SWIFT stand for?
Single Window Investment Facilitation Task Force.
There, the SWIFT is operating now in the BOI, and we are beginning to see a more effective effort to improve the investment climate. And in addition, I think the investment promotion effort has been made much more focused. The BOI has worked with the Center for International Development at Harvard. They've identified some focus areas, and within that, they are developing pitch documents for particular anchor investors. So the whole thing is being made much more focused going forward. And on trade facilitation, I think we are now on the brink of having the single electronic window in customs fully operational. There's a trade portal to address the information asymmetry, which has been set up by the Commerce Department, and that the trade facilitation committee is we were an early signatory of the WTO's trade facilitation agreement, and the committee that has been set up to drive that agenda forward is working at reducing the transaction costs of the cross-border movement of goods and services. Trade policy is potentially the jewel in the crown, in my view. I know it's very controversial, but there is now a national trade strategy. There's a nice 20-30 page document, very concise, because often I hear people say that there is no trade strategy, but there is a document which is worth reading. Then the government has created the enabling environment to move ahead with trade agreements by introducing the Anti-Dumping and Countervailing Duties Act, the Safeguards Provisions Act, and it's also working on a trade adjustment package to support companies which will be adversely affected by liberalization. The trade agreements, which are the most controversial. Now, the agreement with Singapore, which has been completed, from what I have read of that agreement, I have not seen any provision therein to liberalize the movement of natural persons. That is, to allow the movement of professionals into this country, which I see lots of people talking about it, but I have not heard anybody actually cite the provision in the agreement which would enable this. So I think anybody who says that must cite where does it say in the agreement that this is going to happen? I haven't seen it. This is a subject on which there should be a very robust and open debate, but people must stick to facts as well. Then the other, and really why I say this is a potentially the jewel in the crown is that we have this FTA in goods with India. If we're able to deepen and widen it and then include services, investment, technology, training, etc., negotiate a similar agreement with China. If those are successful, I do not know of any other country in the world which has preferential access to China, India, and Europe through the GSP+. So we're talking about a market of over 3.5 million people. And of course, you can throw in the FTA in goods with Pakistan. That is clearly, it can open up opportunities for our own exporters. But the bigger prize is the ability to leverage the trade investment nexus by showing this preferential access to these large markets, leveraging our location, leveraging our very good government-to-government relations, the number of the capital surplus countries in Asia. You bring all that together, and there is a set of circumstances of enormous potential. But clearly we have to get our act together and have a national consensus how we go about doing this. But there is a massive opportunity to be gained. And on the Singapore agreement, it's probably right to say that we're not going to dramatically increase exports to that economy, because that economy, over 90% of their tariff lines were liberalized anyway. So if we were going to export, we would have exported. But what it does do is to create a a better investment climate for potential Singaporean investors in Sri Lanka. And the chapter on e-commerce also offers interesting possibilities. So let me say what that is pretty much all on the growth framework. But let me now talk a little bit about what the government is planning to do in terms of boosting growth in the short term, because some of these measures that I've spoken about will take some time to gain traction and deliver results on the ground. So the government is now pushing out its Gamperia program, which involves investment of 80 billion over 2018 and 2019. The program envisages rehabilitating 4,000 minor irrigation tanks. It's very much focused on rural development. 4,000 minor irrigation tanks, rural roads, rural markets, agricultural supply chains, then things even like school playgrounds and sanitary facilities, so to create a lot of activity around rural communities. And then the second leg of the program to generate growth in the short term is Enterprise Sri Lanka. There were nearly 100 credit schemes in the central bank and the various state banks. Those have now been rationalized into 15. So there are 15 credit schemes. You've seen a lot of advertisements over the last few days. And there's a range of credit for SME development, for enterprise development, and the interest rates range from interest-free to about 6.5–7%. As we're talking about conflict-affected areas. Gosh, I'm way over my time. Let me be quick. Conflict-affected areas. I think the government has also got this. The new incentive scheme involves investment allowances of 100%, and in the conflict-affected areas, you will have 200%, which means that you can write off 300% of your profits, because 200% investment allowance, 200% investment allowance, 100% depreciation means you can write off 300% of your capital against tax. In the north and the east, the conflict-affected areas, and you can write off 200%. of your capital in the rest of the country. So that's a very attractive investment incentive. And in the north and the east, there's a focus still on some infrastructure development, but there are also lessons to be learned, because in the immediate aftermath of the conflict, there was a well-intentioned effort to drive reconstruction and rehabilitation on two pillars. One is developing at least rehabilitating, restoring physical infrastructure, and the other was credit for self-employment. Now, quite a lot of infrastructure has been built, though again, there is more work to be done in terms of the rural roads and rural infrastructure, the rural tanks. But the other plank did not have an unintended consequence, in the sense that a lot of credit was pushed out to the people who had been starved of consumption for 30 years, and they took this credit and basically consumed with it. And now we have a very serious indebtedness problem. Not only that, they did not have the wherewithal to really come up with effective self-employment opportunities. So that has not worked. It's a big problem, and the government is planning to have some kind of relief, but I think we need to realign our strategy. I think in my position I have to give plugs to everything that the government is doing, so let me now talk a little bit about the mega projects. I'm just going to run through them because you probably know more about it than I do. Clearly the megapolis, the port city, the Hambantota area development, the Trincomalee master plan where Singapore, India and Japan are working together, the Kandy master plan by Japan, the industrial zones in Bingiri and Millenia, tourism zones, one in Dedua, and there are a couple of others, and the economic corridors. The government is now talking about around adjoining the southern and central highways. So all these are clearly major plans. The plans have been made; they need to be executed. And I want to say something a little bit about Hambantota, because there's been a lot of debate. Hambantota is not really just a port lease. That's only a very small part of the story. What that long lease of the port does is that it will catalyze several $1 billion of investment. The Chinese, I think, have plans initially to build what they call some foundational investments. I think there is an LNG plant, a refinery, a cement factory, steel billets, and a ship repair. Those facilities, and then also the rolling out of this industrial zone. Now, for 70 years after independence, we have done very little for the people of Uva, of Monragala. The people of Hambantota have some assets, but they don't really work for them. So when you look at that set of circumstances and what the potential that the long lease of the Hambantota port unleashes, clearly, it can be transformational for that area. An area which, of course, has on two occasions has been the heartland of youth insurrections in this country. And this gives us a chance to transform economically that area. There are also initiatives in the education, training and skills development program. There's a 13-year schooling program. There are people here who know much more than I do, but I just thought I'd flag that up because I think a potential binding constraint is human resources. There are all these plans, there are all these projects, but we need to get the human resources strategy right to be able to take advantage of them. Let me very quickly run through the international dimension. It's a big positive that balanced international relations have been restored. Because that creates now the conditions for Sri Lanka to leverage the dynamics of the geopolitics of the Indian Ocean region. Of course, we need to be conscious of geographical realities. Shiv Shankar Menon, he was High Commissioner in Colombo, he was Foreign Secretary, he was National Security Advisor, a man whom I know a little bit, who is a very balanced, very moderate, very nuanced thinker. But in his book, he said, Sri Lanka is like an aircraft carrier parked 20 miles away from India. So that is the mindset you have of the Indian establishment. And it would is not wise for us to ignore that. But even if one takes that into account, there is considerable room to maneuver for Sri Lanka to operate as a sovereign nation in pursuit of its development objectives. So that is a factor, but I don't think it's a limiting factor. And clearly, China has played a major role in the development process in recent years. And what is encouraging is that the two major capital surplus countries in Asia, one being China and the other being Japan, have all had excellent relations have both had excellent relations with Sri Lanka for decades. Japan since President Jayawardena's speech in San Francisco in 1950, and China since the Rubber Rice Pact in 1952. Throughout the years after that, both Sri Lanka has had excellent relations with these countries, and we are now well positioned to leverage the strong government-to-government relations that there are to develop further investment flows. And in China's case, it's interesting that we are now seeing a pivot from debt to investment, debt to equity. Because the projects that are coming on stream now, a number of them will involve equity. Of course, there is some debt as well, but there is this pivot taking place. And to respond to the critique that the Chinese are trapping people in debt, it's really up to the country to do the evaluation. If the country concerned evaluates the project, when there is debt involved, if it evaluates the project well, then you don't need to get trapped in debt. You generate sufficient returns to service that debt. One of the problems we had was maybe we didn't evaluate some of those projects as well as we could have done. Then the other international issue, as Dushni mentioned, is the normalization of monetary policy in the US. It will certainly increase cost of financing. But what we need to do is to get our policies into better shape so that we can drive down the premium attached to the Sri Lankan economy. Because really the financing cost, the premium above the risk-free rate, which usually is the US Treasury rate, the premium above that is based on the level of risk attached to the country concerned. So if we can strengthen our macroeconomic fundamentals and we can drive down the risk premium attached to the Sri Lankan economy, then in net terms, there may well not be a significant increase in the borrowing costs for the country because we have the scope to drive down that premium, and that's what we need to focus on. Also, the general consensus is that the US interest rate cycle this time around will peak at a lower level, by historical standards. So hopefully that, combined with the fact that we have the scope to drive down the premium, will mean that there won't be significant increase in our financing costs. And really interest rates go up when economic activity is strong. So, okay, there is this upward movement in interest rates in the US, but the fact that the US economy is doing well and the fact that it is our largest export market will help us to mitigate any increase in the cost of financing by having more opportunities for our exports in our largest market. And of course now we are seeing synchronized growth in the major countries. Again, Europe is our second largest market, so that again is a tailwind. And oil prices also for us, again, there is a kind of a hedge in the sense that when oil prices go up, our remittances tend to increase as well. And we have seen in the first quarter of this year, there is some increase in remittances. So hopefully, as in the past, increased oil prices and a higher oil bill will be mitigated to some extent by increase in remittances. Okay, so that's it. I'm sorry I've taken so long. What's the conclusion? We've made some progress in stabilizing the economy, as Dushni pointed out. And we are trying to institutionalize the macroeconomic framework so that we can make policy making the improvements in policy making more resilient and durable. And as far as the development strategy is concerned, the government plans are sound. However, execution needs to speed up and improve. Thank you all very much, and I'm sorry I've taken so long.